Hey, it's Drake. You'll have to pardon me for the extended gap between this video and the last one, and feel free to direct any desultory vituperations in the comment section. Sorry, I've just, yeah, I watched that stuff with this FBI agent, and one of the guys used the word vituperations, so I couldn't help myself because it's such a good word. But yeah, I've been busy this whole time. I haven't been making videos, and I have too many books sitting around me right now, and it's almost getting to the point where I'm somewhat embarrassed, but I'm kind of not. But I got this pretty cool, like, bookmark today because I ordered a book. I'll talk about it a little later, but you see this bookmark here. It was just in the book, and I'll read it to you. Warning, rare book pox, highly contagious. There is no known cure. Infection is characterized by dizziness, sweaty palms, and compulsive reading of rare book catalogs, accompanied by apnea and lust. Further symptoms are loss of home living space and self-induced poverty. If infected, do not see your doctor, but seek aid from your local antiquarian book dealer, who, while unable to effect a cure, can provide symptomatic relief. Isn't that so funny? So somehow he's stalking me because he knew exactly what was going on. I'm going to have to look into that probably. But yeah, so the three books I've been basically constantly reading for the last month, at least several months, are three of my favorites. And that's what's somewhat prevented me, not really prevented, but that's what I've been focusing on. Of course, Suttree by Cormac McCarthy. And I just turned to a random page the other day, which is basically how I read this book. I've read it twice the normal way, and then now I just turn to random pages and read it. And I turned to page 113, and I saw this sentence, which is pretty amazing. His subtle obsession with uniqueness troubled all his dreams. And then he goes on. He saw his brother in swaddling, hands outheld, a scent of myrrh and lilies. But it was the voice of Jean Harrogate that called to him, where he tossed on his bunk in the murmurous noon. Harrogate's hand, in supplication from the tailgate of a truck, face waffled in the wire mesh, calling. Suttree sat up groggily. His hair lay matted on his skull, and beads of sweat trickled on his face. Hey, Sut. Just a minute. So, I mean, that's just amazing, you know. It's my favorite book. And then also, just in general, partially because of Paperbird's 90s video he just did, which is amazing. I've been loving that video because I've been partially his fault into the 90s a lot lately, but The Lost Scrapbook, Evan Dara. And there's also, he has a book coming out apparently this month that's a play. So you can keep an eye out for that if you guys like Evan Dara. I'm certainly keeping an eye out for it. And then lastly, which I have a somewhat ridiculous story about, the Recognitions. I've been really getting into Gaddis again. I've almost listened to all of JR on audiobook because when I drive back and forth from Austin to here, it's like at least 3 hours. And considering that the book is chiefly in dialogue, it actually works pretty well in audiobook. It's not going to prevent me from actually reading the whole thing, but it's nice. I'm getting a lot out of it. And this book, I have a ridiculous story. So sometimes I bring books in my car when I go to work so I can, read them on lunch break so I can survive. And I brought this book maybe 2 weeks ago. And it's been excessively hot in Texas, like over 100 degrees for weeks at a time. And this book melted. The Recognitions melted. You see the spine there? See, it's like kind of crooked and you can see the glue. it melted. It melted the glue. I couldn't believe it, but it didn't do that bad. Like, it's still a functioning book. Like, it doesn't fall apart or anything, but man, I couldn't believe it. I was so distressed. But it still works. And apart from those books, I have like 4 different stacks here, and I'm basically just going to go through them at random, and if I don't finish one for one reason or another, I'll probably end up making a video right after this. So if I'm wearing the same shirt in the same pose, um, even though it'll be fairly obvious, I'm verbalizing it now, so it'll be even more obvious. But yeah, so let's see, what do I want to talk about first? Well, I guess I'll just do some like interesting books, interesting rare books. So the first one is actually where I got that bookmark from. It's Confessions of a Nowadays Child by Erje Ayden. He's a Turkish writer who moved to New York in the 1950s, if I remember correctly. And this book was published in the 60s, and it's dedicated, one of the dedications is to Frank O'Hara, who I believe actually reviewed the book. And yeah, this guy was friends with John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, all those guys, William de Kooning. And this is a story about him living in New York, but also memories of his childhood in Turkey. And I actually found out about this because there's this press. It seems like it's just one dude who does Kickstarters for a book. He most recently did Gil Orlovitz, and this is his most recent one that's still currently going on. And I'll include a link to that where he is rounding up money for a set of paperbacks. But I happened to find this for like $20, and it's signed. It's signed by the guy. So yeah, it's like, screw it. I mean, might as well, might as well. Because it was the last one I saw online. I'm sure they're laying around somewhere, but yeah, that's the last one I saw for now. Another interesting book I got for like $2 is 17th Tractatus on Words, Selected Poems by Andrew Curry. It's really neat. It starts out with like 20 pages of a tractatus talking about his like philosophy on poetry, and then it just goes into some of his poetry. And I won't read any of the philosophical portion, but I will read one of the poems. I like this one. Some people have said they didn't, but I do. So it's a second glimpse of a naked girl surprised. Her breasts and flashing eyes twisted from the clutch now wrinkled and sagging in tiny wonderment. Like modesty, her belly smiled beneath metallic glances, and fingers that could not cover nipples and crimson skin freckled blushing as her head turned. Running by my gaze, she giggled, and I, sighing, thought. And then the next pages. Be trenches squalid and inhabited, though silent like soil, crumbling into decadence. Our century is only unalterable. The war, the rape, gentle slaughter of me and houses, the rubble, starvation, and alienation of generations, rebellion and damnation, the tangled minds, dissociation, forgetfulness, resurrection, squalid, oh honey, squalid them trenches be. So, yeah, I really enjoyed that one. And this guy was actually, he's black. He's a psychiatrist in the 1970s. And he actually published psychiatric papers that you can find online. And I couldn't find anything about his poetry, unfortunately. As far as I can tell, this is all there is. It was put out by Dust, is the name of the press, Dust Books. And I couldn't find much about it, unfortunately. But yeah, this cover, I mean, that's really interesting, isn't it? 17th Tractatus on Words. But yeah, I thought that was pretty neat. I found that at the bookstore near me in Denton. And another book I found there, which is pretty interesting too. So I go to this Finnegans Wake reading group, and mentioned it before on here. And the head guy, like the guy who started it, he's a really cool guy, and he just recently did a presentation in Belgium for Bloomsday. You know, they do like a Joyce conference, and his presentation was titled Finnegans Woke, and I'll include a link to it to his blog because he wrote out the whole thing. Well, one of the authors he mentioned was William Melvin Kelly, and I had really never looked into him. I'd heard his name, but I didn't really pay attention. But he mentioned that one of his books called Dunford's Travels Everywheres was heavily influenced by Finnegans Wake. And apparently he's the guy who came up with the term woke in the contemporary usage. So I thought that was pretty neat. So just kind of like as an offhand thing, I was never expecting to find it. I looked at my bookstore in Denton to see if they had the book, and sure enough, they had it. And the even crazier thing about it is, so I usually look on Amazon just to make sure I'm not getting ripped off massively. So I looked up this book on Amazon because it was $10 to buy it at the bookstore. So I'm like, okay, I'm probably just going to end up buying it, but I'll check anyway. I couldn't find a copy on Amazon for less than $500. And I was like, this isn't like one of those weird algorithm like step up things where they just constantly raise each other and then it's ridiculous prices. Then I look on Abe Books, can't find a copy for less than 200, and I'm like, something's not right. So I bought the book for $10, and this is what it looks like. It actually has a pretty interesting cover. It's a little hard to see. Yeah, sorry for the lighting, but and I've read a little bit of it, and it is pretty neat. It doesn't quite match Finnegans Wake as you'd imagine, but it is pretty neat. So, and then the last interesting book I actually got today. I drove down to Austin just for like a day trip, checking on things, and there's this book I've been looking for a while. It's related to Native Americans. It's called Seven Arrows. And I don't know this first name. Hemiost's Storm. See that first name there? You see it? There you go. It's an unusual name. But it's a very interesting book, and whenever I hear people talking about Native American books, this is one that's always mentioned. And I've been really interested in it for several years now, but I just never could find a really good copy. Here, I'll show you some of the things here. Hopefully you could see that. I was kind of guessing where it was pointing, but yeah, so that one's a really interesting one. If you're interested in Native Americans, I'd recommend checking that one out because as far as I can tell, the three that are recommended is that one, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and then Black Elk Speaks. At least, like, those are the ones that I see most, and the Zit Kalasa also, but, like, yeah, and I've read some of Black Elk Speaks, and I really enjoyed that because John Neihart is also a good poet apart from that. So I think if anyone could have captured at the time, I think he had a good chance. But this one's actually written by, like an actual true Indian. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. And then let's see here. So I guess I'll go to two other books by the same writer. And the guy so I had never heard of this writer before, Chandler Brossard. And I also heard of him through the guy who does the Finnegans Wake group. Yeah, he's been a bad influence so far. But Chandler Brossard was born in 1922, I'm fairly certain. I think in Idaho or something. He was born in the same year as William Gaddis. And he also went to New York and was in like the Greenwich Village crowd and things. And his first book was published in 1952, if I remember correctly. And it's titled Who Walk in Darkness. This is, I got lucky again. I can't believe my luck, but this was at the bookstore in Denton. It's a first edition, so it's from 1952. And I've read a little bit of it so far. It's written in kind of like a simple style. It's been compared to the existentialists like Albert Camus, and I would say that's justifiable because Camus also writes in kind of like a I don't know if it's called minimalist or whatever, but it's just kind of like a simple style. Anyone can read it basically, and so far this is what this book is written in too, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't necessarily align with my tastes, but that doesn't mean the book's bad. But yeah, here's the guy. And yeah, born in Idaho Falls in 1922. And actually, how the guy told me about him was I had told him that The Recognitions was one of my favorite books because he had mentioned it. And then he said that he was reading My Back Pages by Stephen Moore. And Stephen Moore is like basically the expert on William Gaddis. And he told me that that Stephen Moore recommended quite a lot Chandler Brossard as like a 1950s writer, but then also later. And the book that he mentioned was Wake Up, We're Almost There. And which is apparently like the book of the 60s, I guess is how Stephen Moore describes it. And amazingly enough, you can find first edition copies for like $10. So if you're interested, there's still several out there. This Who Walk in Darkness is a little bit more difficult to find, but I got mine for $20, so it's not really super expensive. But yeah, here's the other one. Wake Up, We're Almost Here. And I'll just read the back in case you're interested. Getting Sylvia to make love was a calculated descent into the most treacherous of labyrinths. But I could no more keep myself from making it than I could command my heart to stop beating. From the very moment the song of my loins was heard, the gates of hell opened for me. God only knows what fragile thing would provoke this fatal music. A suddenly exposed shoulder strap, a faint smell of perfume, or even the careful way she would munch a brownie with her after-dinner coffee. Trembling inside myself with apprehension, I would begin my advance. And that's a little like strong, but the first page is also fairly funny. I ordered this, so I got it anyway, but the first page is pretty good. This is dialogue. It skips a little paragraph here, and then, I skip a paragraph. And then, so it goes like this. It's the two characters talking. "Why do you have to play that crummy music all the time?" she would ask from her traditional position on the sofa. "That's Boccherini. He ought to be deported." "He's a wonderful composer," I would say, making my way slowly up the wall. "And besides, listening to him relaxes me." "You know what I think would really relax you?" A smile like a snakehead. "What?" "A good jump off the George Washington Bridge." I reach the ceiling and hang there upside down. "You obviously don't care what pleases me. As far as you're concerned, I don't exist." "That's the most intelligent thing you've said all week." So that's the dialogue from the first page. And it's in a completely different style than this Wake Up, We're Almost There. So, what am I saying? It's in a completely different style than Who Walk in Darkness, his first book. This one was published about 20 years later, if I remember correctly. A little bit less than 20 years later. But um, my other like really big interest lately has been in debut novels. So I've already mentioned several, but my two favorites are The Lost Scrapbook and The Recognitions. And I really have been trying to find similar books because there's just something about a writer writing in their late 20s, early 30s. Just, it's almost like an ecstatic type of creativity, at least for these really good authors. And I really, really enjoy it. And I've had trouble finding similar books. McCarthy's really isn't the same type. I mean, it's extremely good. It's a very good book, The Orchard Keeper, but it's not the same type of just, just ecstatic type of creativity, just overflowing. Um, I've tried to think of similar authors who could maybe be compared. Melville really isn't. I mean, his books are good, but you'd have to count like Marty or Moby Dick as like his debut for it to be valid. Um, I mean, I was thinking John Dos Passos, but he's not really. I was just thinking specifically of American authors, the debut. But one other author who had kind of like a completely ridiculous and unbelievable debut was Miklos Senkuthi, who I've been reading for a little while now. Contramundum Press just put out another one of his books, A Black Renaissance, which is the second book in the Saint Orpheus Breviary um, collection. But the first part is out of Prey in English, and it's one of those just like unbelievable books that you can't even believe that he wrote, because he wrote it when he was 25, which in and of itself is just you know pretty ridiculous. How much he can include in it, and just the creativity of it. That's what it is. Um, if you don't know much about him, he's an extremely interesting guy. There's a good website on him on this Hungarian literature website. I've talked about him several times before, but there are, I believe, 4 books out now of his in English. Pray, Towards the One and Only Metaphor, and then 2 volumes of the St. Orpheus Breviary. I'm One thing I'm really excited for the future, and I'm sure it'll be 20, 30 years out, is apparently he wrote journals or diaries for almost his whole life, and it's like 20,000 pages or something. And you know how Casanova, Marginalia on Casanova is one of the books in the St. Orpheus Breviary. And he had an idea to do that because Casanova is he's a really smart guy, basically did everything in the 18th century. And there's something about just like this, like really wordy, intelligent figure that you can see everything in their time period through their words. I really see Gaddis as like this because they just include so much that you can just see everything. And inevitably, like when I read the Recognitions, I just fell in love. Well, like it's like a rough type of love, but I fell in love with the 1950s because in the 1940s, that type of mid-century America. And I've just wanted to learn everything about it since I've read him because it's just so dense and includes everything, and it's so enticing to me. But I get the same impression that this happened with Miklos Senkuthi and Casanova, and he apparently was doing something with Karl Barth's technique of analyzing a text. But he's a very interesting guy, yeah. And Prey is a completely unbelievable debut work. And I just recently, partially because of Paperbird's insistence or recommendation, I've been trying to get into William T. Vollmann because he's, of course, been on my radar for several years now, especially through the interviews he did with Michael Silverblatt with Bookworm. But he's also just a very interesting guy. And the other day I went through the Whiting Award, which is an award for like an author that's starting out. And I went through like maybe half of them, which ends up being like over like 150 people that I looked into, and I was so disappointed. It seems like they fell into two categories. It was either like a professor or a like token minority writer. And I know it's kind of aggressive to put it that way, but it's true. Their books were just like horribly boring if you read excerpts from them. You just saw they were typical, like, minority baiting type things. And one of the only interesting authors I found on there, well, there were several in the beginning days because I think it started in 1985, but like David Foster Wallace is on there. I'm not super interested in him quite yet, but inevitably for the 90s stuff I'm doing, I'll read his stuff. But yeah, William T. Vollmann was one of the early winners of that award. And I've just recently bought and looked into his first book, You Bright and Risen Angels, which is another one of these kind of ecstatic debut novels. It was put out when he was 28 and in 1987. And here it is. But refreshingly, he wasn't this like academic type, because I'm really getting so sick of these writers who are academics. They just write the most boring stuff on earth, and I just hate reading it, really. It's unfortunate, but so many of it is just like weird textual experimentation or really boring stuff. And maybe I'll like it when I get older, but I actually been looking into Robert Coover also, who's another debut novel I've been looking into, The Origin of the Brunists. And it's not quite in the same like ecstatic creativity vein that I'm talking about, but I watched an interview with him where he talked about himself and Bill Gaddis, I think he called him. And he said that one of the reasons that they were successful, or at least accomplished works of art, basically, is like what he was getting at, is that they didn't get taught how to write. And Robert Coover in this interview recommended people do not go into creative writing programs because he said they don't do very much good. I mean, that's what he said in this interview. He was fairly old, so maybe he changed his opinion later, because I'm pretty sure he taught some. I may be wrong, but I've always felt that way about creative writing stuff, which basically it's a guess for me because I've never taken a class, but like the teachers just, I mean, you can probably get a good teacher, and that would probably help. But so many of the teachers are not even good writers themselves, so why would you want to learn from them? What could you learn from them? How not to write? Well, just read stuff. So I think, yeah, reading is definitely the best way to learn how to write. It's interesting, Robert Coover, I think he's trying to be a contrarian, because he says the best way, he says, most people say when you want to learn how to write, you need to read a lot. But I actually think you should write a lot. And it's like, okay, dude. It's like literally every good writer says to read a lot, and he probably knows that and probably tired of that, advice. So he does something else. But I don't know. He's probably right too. You need to write too. But yeah, so I don't know. So Robert Cooper is pretty interesting. I'm really not interested at all in his like metafictional stuff, but this Origin of the Brunists and the Brunist Day of Wrath, I'm really interested in those. And I'll probably, as time goes on, read both and I'm pretty sure I'll enjoy them quite a lot too. Um, yeah, just kind of like a background thing I've been doing, and it's not really systematic, but I'm really trying to learn everything about American literature, specifically from the 19th and 20th century, and of course the 21st century now that it's going on. Um, I don't know. I guess it's kind of simplistic why. It's just because I was born here, and I prefer to read things originally in English. Now, a lot of my favorite writers didn't, but if I could, I'd prefer to read originally in English, just because I feel like I really understand the language really well, and I feel like I can get a lot out of it. And I'm doing pretty well for the modernist period. Like there's very few authors that I don't know about from that time period, and I know about a lot of them really well. The mid-century, I'm a little weak on. I mean, I know, the typical people, J.D. Salinger, the Beats, and all those types. Uh, but Gaddis is my favorite, and he seems definitely the best without even, very little competition. And then you get like the guys who were debut novels in the 60s and like Pynchon, DeLillo, McCarthy, Roth, uh, Joseph McElroy, I guess Coover, Barth, all these guys. I'm getting a little bit better with them, but this most of this metafictional stuff, it's very tiring for me very quickly. So I really have no interest in that. I mean, McCarthy's my favorite writer, at least like McCarthy and Gaddis it is now. I used to say McCarthy without a doubt, but now Gaddis is just like shit. He's very good. But yeah, McCarthy's way up there for me, and he doesn't do any of this, like weird metafictional stuff, which I really appreciate. I think he has good taste to do it, to not do that. But I can appreciate some of it, like I've been recently reading Raymond Fetterman, Take It or Leave It, and it's just so like in your face that it's just kind of like you just go on a ride, and it's kind of enjoyable that way. But some of this stuff, it just gets so tiring for me very quickly. Like Pale Fire. I mean, it was an interesting book. By the end, I enjoyed it a lot more, but I just don't see the point in the end. I asked myself when I'm done reading it, what's the point? Why not just write an actual book? I know that's kind of simplistic, but still, that's how I feel. And going past that, I'm a little weak on the 80s. I don't really know any writers from the 80s. I mean, I know a couple like Richard Powers and William T. Vollmann, but I haven't really read them. And some of the other 80s writers, like I think Bret Easton Ellis counts as one, and some of these other guys. I'll probably read them eventually, but it's just not a priority at all. And then the 90s, I'm really getting into the 90s. A lot of those 80s guys overlap, but yeah, I really loved Paperbird's most recent video about the 90s. That was very interesting. And then the 2000s, I'm pretty weak on. And then like a little, contemporary, I'm getting a little better. But yeah, speaking of the 2000s, though, this alt-lit stuff with like Tao Lin and all these people, I'm actually trying to read them now. I ordered several books that should be in tomorrow. An anthology published by Civil Coping Mechanisms is the name of the publisher. 40 writers of this alt-lit group. And then I ordered books by Megan Boyle and Mary Calloway. Megan Boyle has a new book coming out called Live Blog that I'm really interested in. And her first book was published in 2011, I believe. And I read parts of it online, and I actually think it's pretty neat. It's kind of like, but it's definitely not great art. Like it's not even close to an actual poem or, McCarthy, Gaddis. It's definitely not even in the same category. It would be a joke. It's to their benefit that it's not in the same category. But it's at least interesting. I really see a lot of contemporary writing as like etudes. Like, it's not great stuff, but you can kind of enjoy it and you can learn from it. That's kind of how I see almost all contemporary poetry and contemporary writing. But I'm open-minded about this stuff. I'm open-minded about it. And yeah, so that's kind of like an overview of what I've been into. So I'll probably have to wait on some stuff I have here, because I have a whole stack of 90s and 2000s books here that I've recently got. Some of them are Women and Men by Joseph McElroy, Richard Grossman, Kenneth Goldsmith, and Michael Brodsky. I'll make a whole video on that. And then also I've found some more recent books. The Late Parade by Adam Fitzgerald is a set of poems. It's pretty good. And then Love Songs and Monster Songs by G.M. Holder. Now that's a pretty, like, a rare book. Like, you probably wouldn't have found it before. But he kind of reminds me of Volman in a way, because, you know, Volman went to Afghanistan. This guy went to Sarajevo and like Bosnia, Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and basically spent a while there. And this was in 2002. This guy was in his early 20s, similar to what William T. Volman did in Afghanistan. And yeah, this guy, G.M. Holder, definitely has read a lot. Tons of his chapter titles are references to literature, and he does write in a very good way. And this is what it says about his biography. G.M. Holder was born in the United States in 1977. In 2002, at the age of 24, he traveled alone to post-war former Yugoslavia, where he lived for 8 months, compiling many of the stories that appear in this book. After returning to the U.S., he lived closely with Bosnian and Croatian refugees for the next 5 years. He is currently at work on a trilogy about the Zodiac Murderer, a Walt Whitman-esque fantasia concerning gutter punk, train hopping, and hitchhiking cultures, and a novel about chronic pain. Since 2000, he has lived in Portland, Oregon. He is the author of The Introduction to the World. And there's a review by Scott McClanahan, who's apparently in this alt-lit group, though I think he's not a good writer. I mean, he seems like a nice guy. And I think he has like the artist spirit, but I think he's just not talented. And I think it's kind of blunt to say it like that, but I think it's true. Because I've read one of his books, Hill William, and it wasn't good. And I've tried to read some of his other stuff. But I've watched an interview by him, and he's an interesting guy. He wants to become a stand-up comedian, I guess. Unless that's a joke. But, yeah. I hope he has success. But I was also thinking about Ben Lerner. Like, Ben Lerner's not really in this alt-lit group, but I think he's also not talented. And it's unfortunate. It's really unfortunate. But, yeah, so I know this was kind of like just like blasting all these books that I got. But I'm planning some more focus videos. And I think they'll be pretty good. So, something to look forward to. Oh, and since you made it this far, I'm actually going to do a giveaway here. And it's going to be Mario Papaschiaro. One of his, like, kind of a long poem, I guess you'd say. It's like 20 pages or so. He was a friend of Bolaño. He's actually one of the characters in The Savage Detectives is based on him. He was an actual Mexican poet, and Bolaño was good friends with him. But if you're interested in this collection or this little poem by Papaschiaro, I can't remember the exact title, but it's like a conversation between a Heidegger fanatic and a Marx disciple, a disciple of Marx and a Heidegger fanatic, something like that. If you want to look it up, that's what it is. And I will send it to you if you put an anecdote in the comment section, and it will be chosen at random, but it may be less random if there's a particularly good anecdote in the comment section. If no one leaves any anecdotes, then I'll assume this book is not desirable. But, feel free to make up stuff, make up anecdotes. Feel free to use actual ones, whatever. But, yeah, so hope you enjoyed the video. Feel free to leave any comments, any recommendations on books that you think would fit in any of these categories I'm thinking about, like debut novels, 90s books, contemporary books. I'd appreciate it. So, Death is a Gang Boss.